Okay, so hello everybody. I see a few participants and attendees have come into the room now, so excellent, we can get started on time. So my name is Kieran Flood. I'm the coordinator of the Irish Wildlife Trust, and you're very welcome to this event where we'll be discussing the new report by the Fair Seas campaign, Revitalising Our Seas. So if that's what you're interested in, then you're in the right place. We'll have you for about an hour. We'll finish up around 12. And it's a webinar, so as usual, if you have any questions, you can just pop them into the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. We have a Q&A function there. We'll monitor that, and our speakers will get back to the Q&A questions at the end. There's also the chat there, so you can just chat amongst yourselves and generally express yourself in the chat. But there, we won't be monitoring that for questions. So if you have a specific question you want addressed, stick it in the Q&A and we shall do our best to get around to those at the end. So that's a bit of housekeeping. We'll finish around 12. The Q&A is there for your use. Okay, so to the event itself. As I said, my name is Kieran Flood. I'm coordinator of the Irish Wildlife Trust. The Irish Wildlife Trust have been working on marine protected areas for over 3 years now. We started off working on a project with seas at risk on a European level to make MPAs work better in Europe. But in the last year or so, we've been involved in an Irish campaign, which is super exciting. And it's really needed because marine protected areas is a really important area. So that's what we'll be looking at today. We're looking at the report that was launched by this new campaign called Fair Seas. So we have a few speakers here, but first I'm actually going to share a quick video, which gives you a taste and flavor of the campaign. And then we'll get back to get chatting. So here comes a little video.
Hello Ireland, it's me, your sea. Remember that summer holiday? You were so small, you tried to jump over the waves and you squealed as I chased you back up the beach. Or that day when you cycled an hour just to sit and look out at the shore and the birds, it helped you relax. Normally I'm quite modest, but the water, plants, fish, birds, whales and sharks, they're all parts of me. I help support all kinds of life in an area 7 times bigger than our island. But we've been struggling. We've been under pressure for a long time because of things like industrial activity and pollution. In fact, 65% of our coastal habitats are not healthy at all. Now, we need your help. Healthy seas means healthy people. There's a group called Fair Seas who have this goal to bring people together to conserve and restore me and all the biodiversity I support. They want to give our species, habitats and coastal communities the opportunity to thrive. This means giving special areas, new marine protected areas, a break from damaging activity. To give us the chance to bounce back, Fair Seas wants to increase my marine protected areas from 2% to 30% by 2030. Then I can do my part. I'll store carbon, fight climate change, restore habitats and species, feed life and support livelihoods. What do you say? Love, your sea.
Okay, so that was lovely. That gives you a taste of Fair Seas campaign and its goals. But to get further into that, we will hear from our speakers. So I'm just going to quickly let you know who's in the virtual room here to speak to you, and then I'll hand over to them. So we have, first up, we're going to have Aoife Mahony, who is the Fair Seas campaign manager. Aoife will just give you a little bit more information about the campaign itself, so you know who you're dealing with. Then we're going to have Regina Classen, who is the Marine Policy and Research Officer at the Irish Wildlife Trust. Regina was an author of the report we're going to be discussing. Then we'll have more people involved in the report. We have Sinead Loughran, who's the Policy and Advocacy Officer with BirdWatch Ireland. Sinead will be discussing some of the bird-related elements of the report. And then we have Dr. Simon Berrow, the Chief Executive Officer of the Irish Whale and Dolphin Group. And as you may have guessed, Simon will be discussing the cetacean aspects of the report and the importance of Irish waters for cetaceans. So that's the lineup. So I hope you enjoy the talks. The Q&A is there for your questions. And I will now hand over to Aoife to say hi and tell us about Fair Seas.
Thanks, Kieran. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us here today. This is probably the last official side event of the UN Oceans Conference this year, and we're delighted to have so many people joining us online this morning. Last week, the team and I spent a few days at the official UN Oceans Conference in Lisbon. It was a great opportunity to learn from others in this area and see what actions are happening all around the world. There were many announcements made over the week, with over 150 countries promising to protect, conserve, and restore their oceans by and before 2030. In Ireland, as we know, we currently have only 2% of our EEZ protected, which pales in comparison. We hope that at the next UN Oceans Conference in France in 2025, we will have a greater percentage protected with a clear pathway to 30%. The Fair Seas campaign is a coalition of ENGO organisations and networks working together in Ireland to build a movement of ocean stewardship. Our aim is to see Ireland, with a renewed appreciation of the ocean, become a world leader in marine protection, giving our species, habitats, and coastal communities the opportunity to thrive. We hope to have your support for this campaign over the coming years. Please do take the time to sign up for our monthly newsletter and follow us online as we build this movement of ocean stewardship in Ireland. Our website is fairseas.ie, and you can sign up there. We thank you for taking the time to join us this morning to learn more about our recently published report. We hope this report will accelerate the conversation on MPAs in Ireland and help us protect, conserve, and restore our oceans for generations to come. I think you'll really enjoy all the presentations this morning. There is plenty of information for everybody to absorb, and I'll hand over now to Regina.
So, Regina, if you want to go ahead, and just to say, we'll actually stick a link to downloading this fantastic report into the chat for anyone who wants to get their hands on the report. So go ahead there, Regina.
Thank you. Can you all see that?
I can see that fine, yeah.
Okay. Yep, so I'm Regina and I'm one of the co-authors of this report. It's called Revitalising Our Seas. And the aim was to identify areas of interest for marine protected area designation in Irish waters. And really the purpose of this was to kick off the discussion on MPA locations to accelerate the designation. So it's important to keep in mind that we are an environmental campaign, and this process was just to really shadow what the government is going to do. So the government is going to do a much more detailed analysis of all of this. For us, it was just important to have something in hand to start engaging through our campaign with local communities and with the government, to have an ask from the campaign to kick things off. So just to keep that in mind as we go through these methods as well. So the first item on the agenda really was to identify species of conservation importance. And this was important because we couldn't possibly look at all marine biodiversity in Ireland. We had to come up with a short list of species. So that's the first thing we did. And just to give you an overview, this is just a screen grab from the report. So this is not the full list. But we had like 5 broad groups. So we looked at seabed features, so any kind of animals and plants that were of importance that are attached to the seabed, commercially exploited species, and specifically species that are fished above maximum sustainable yield. So species you could say are currently overfished or have stocks that are overfished in Irish waters. And crucially then, I looked at not only those that are fished above maximum sustainable yield, but those that we had data for the existing spawning grounds. So I didn't do a full analysis of all of these kind of distributions of these species, but just mapped the known spawning grounds. So again, important to keep in mind, existing data that we could use that was readily available. This data specifically is from 2009. It was developed by the International Council for the Exploration of the Sea. So it might be a little bit outdated, but it's the best we had for this analysis. Then we're going to hear later from the Irish Whale and Dolphin group, who looked at cetaceans. I also looked at elasmobranchs, so sharks, skates, and rays, and specifically those that are in one of the kind of endangered categories, so vulnerable, endangered, or critically endangered in Ireland. And then we're going to hear from BirdWatch Ireland, who looked at seabird distributions. So then once we had our list of species, we had to identify, okay, where are we going to actually get this data sources? So that again took a little time. And we've identified data sources that were available and some that weren't available. So again, there's more data out there that we just weren't able to get. So that's also a really important point to keep in mind. And then to map the species occurrence, density, and richness, this applied to certainly the elasmobranchs and I believe the cetaceans as well. We're going to hear more from Sinead about the seabirds. We used slightly different methods for the seabirds. So again, it really depended on the kind of data that we had available, what analysis we could do. So I'll give you an example of the elasmobranchs, the sharks, skates, and rays, where we had we kind of conducted a species richness and density analysis. So this is the richness, which shows you, I used trawl surveys, fisheries trawl surveys, which are conducted on an annual basis, twice a year, even for the Irish Sea, and a deep water survey, which was conducted in the deeper waters here. So a mixture of data again, and a mixture of methods used by those surveys. So that was important to keep in mind as well when we're kind of interpreting this data. But it did kind of show us areas that the darker areas are areas where there are more species found, and the lighter areas are less species. So it did give us some indication of where important areas might be. And then on top of that, we also looked at density. So we have Portuguese dogfish here, which clearly prefers deeper waters of the continental slope, possibly even the deeper waters away from the continental slope, but I didn't have data for that, so I can't speak to that. Again, one of the issues, just available data, sometimes there are gaps. Taupe shark, you can see, prefers kind of the Irish Sea as well, generally more sedimentary areas, and then the spur dog also seems to quite like the Irish Sea and kind of the sedimentary areas all around the coast really, and the Galway Clare areas. So this is how we arrived at areas of interest for our different species groups. So again, with the sharks, then I would draw lines around areas that seemed important for certain species based on the high densities or high species richness. So the black dotted areas are areas of interest for elasmobranchs, whereas the red are final areas of interest, which looked at all the species groups. So there was a lot of kind of going back and forth and trying to identify areas where a lot of these species groups overlap, which wasn't easy. Here you can see seabed features overlapping. So we have the corals that generally like to kind of grow along the continental slope as well. We have sea pens and nephrops generally overlap over kind of muddy ground. Horse mussel beds in the Irish Sea, really interesting. I had no idea they were there. The data isn't that recent, so again, perhaps worth checking for future researchers whether that's still the case and those horse mussel beds are still there in the Irish Sea. And for commercially exploited species, I overlap the spawning grounds. So areas that are darker are where more species overlap. So the Irish Sea showed up quite highly for nephrops, for cod, for haddock, as well as the south coast. So really interesting, just looking at the overlap of spawning grounds. So we're going to hear more later on about cetaceans and birds. So for now, I'm just going to give a really brief overview of what we found. And that's generally that there were 16 areas of interest that we identified. That doesn't mean that the areas in between are not important. It just means that for this analysis, this first step, the areas we identified are of highest priority to us and to the species that we looked at. So there's lots more work to be done in order to fine tune and build this network, which will be the government's job, who will be in charge of designation. So it's about 36% of Ireland's seas, actually. So we're above the 30% target that the government has set themselves for 2030. And just to briefly go into a couple of these areas in more detail, I've chosen Loophead to Kenmare area of interest to zoom into. And this map also shows existing protected areas. So this is the River Shannon, we've got Blasket Islands, SAC, SPA. So these are existing kind of Natura 2000 sites that Ireland already has designated. But crucially, those areas have substantial gaps. For example, it's known that Tralee Bay is one of the last remaining hotspots for critically endangered angel shark. And the existing protection does not include angel shark in its list of protected species. So generally, it doesn't mean much for sharks. So it's important to designate areas that include a wider range of important species. We have currently no means of protecting sharks in Irish waters. So basking sharks, we had quite high sightings around Dingle Bay area. It's really, really interesting. The blaskets, and these figures are in the report, forgive me if I get this wrong, but blaskets have 60% of the entire breeding population of Manx shearwater. Puffin Island, extremely important for puffins, and the skelligs have over 70% of the entire breeding population of gannets. And those, of course, are seabirds, and they forage in the areas around where they breed. So important to designate a much larger area than where they're actually nesting for their protection, and crucially to also ensure that we rebuild the fish populations that these species rely on. And another one, just to briefly show you the Northwest Continental Shelf and Abyss area of interest. So it's our largest area of interest. That alone covers around 11% of the Irish maritime area. But, and we're going to hear more later on, we have deep diving whale species that use this area. We have coral reefs growing all along the continental slope. We have Ireland's only seamount in this area up here. And this is actually a protected area on the Scottish side. So absolutely crucial that we also protect the Irish side. These photos are actually taken in the on the Scottish side of the seamount. So we have corals and other really interesting deep sea species living around here. So important that we protect that. And deep sea sharks also use this area around here, which is all we had data for. So whether they use this area as well, I don't know. It's a question for a shark ecologist, but we decided to go for quite a large area just based on the whale species that are using these places, and they obviously migrate over large distances. So important to have large marine protected areas. Okay, and that takes us to the seabirds.
Thanks, Regina, for keeping such good time. Sinead's just going to set up her presentation and share that with everyone now.
Yes, so hopefully everyone can see that now.
That looks good.
Perfect, thank you, Kieran, and thanks, Regina. So yeah, to talk you through the seabird methodology, I'm going to start by outlining the initial stages, and that was obviously the first few steps of data collections for seabird data analysis was very similar and to the rest of the taxa groups. So we started by identifying those species that were of conservation importance and also identifying existing data sources. So we created a database of seabird records that spanned over 40 years from 1980 to 2020, and there were over 170,000 records included in that. And from that, there were 38 seabird species included in the entire study. Looking then at the seabird hotspot analysis, this is where, as Regina mentioned earlier, there's a little bit of differentiation in the seabird analysis. And for this, we looked at red and amber listed seabird species according to the Birds of Conservation Concern in Ireland. And we made 3 groups out of that. So we had red listed species, amber listed terns, and amber listed gulls. From that, then the records that were most recent were prioritised. So a weighting was applied to older records to reduce their significance. And then the more diverse seabird areas actually scored higher as well. So for each of those three areas, the red listed species, amber listed terns, and amber listed gulls, we combined the scores of all of the records and applied them to a 10-kilometre square. And those squares with higher species diversity scored higher. Next, then we looked at mapping species occurrence, density, and richness, and we included foraging range of major seabird colonies in that, and also migration bottlenecks. And then we circle back to draw the areas of interest for seabird groups, for the seabird group, and overlap with the areas of interest for the other taxa groups. So to explain and show an example of how the seabird data was applied to the final areas of interest, we'll look at the southeast coast area of interest that appears in the final report. So on this map, you can see that these grid areas are the final areas outlined in our report. And over on the right, you can see a zoomed in version of what was originally the seabird area of interest from seabird data analysis, so in the red, with the final area of interest in the report in the grid section underneath. So species richness was one of the base criteria across all taxa groups in the report. And as you can see from this map here, the Irish Sea has very high species richness, and also some areas around southeast Wexford and Cork as well. So that southeast coast area of interest, you can see there's very high species richness there. Moving on then to look at hotspots for red and amber listed species, we have the three groups here. So our red listed species, our amber listed terns, and our amber listed gulls. And what is important, I suppose, across all of these is that the southeast coast area of interest has hotspot areas for all three groups. If we dive into each group of species and looking first at red list species, you can see that the hotspots mainly occur close to the coast, and they're kind of where colonies are located and where there are the most recent records. And then there are also some offshore hotspots to the west and the north. Moving on to the amber listed terns, you can see that the Irish Sea is incredibly important for this group, with hotspots occurring only within the Irish Sea area. So it's obviously incredibly important. And this is where the kind of most recent records are, and where there are important tern populations within the Irish marine area. And then also moving on to the amber listed gulls, you can see the hotspots were identified around the Irish Sea and the Celtic Sea, and there are large clusters identified around Cork Harbour, Waterford and Wexford. So again, southeast coast area of interest, very important for all of these hotspots. We also looked at foraging range of major colonies and seabird areas. And for this, we looked at the foraging range of 12 species. So that included the 5 tern species that breed in Ireland. It also included 3 gull species, 2 auk species, and cormorant and shag. And for this study, the maximum foraging radii was mapped to show the potential foraging range. And the foraging range is essentially the area that seabirds will exploit mainly for their food supply during the period of nesting and chick rearing. And it's important to include this in any kind of analysis looking at potential areas for conservation measures. For seabirds, foraging activity has a lot to do with overall success of breeding and colony size. So research has shown that colony size can be impacted by foraging range, and also that the overall success of breeding can be impacted by the parent bird's foraging habits as well. And obviously this can be influenced by the type of diet that the specific seabird species has, whether it's a generalist diet or a more specialist diet. But it is really important to include the foraging range in any kind of conservation measure designation, or at least looking at potential areas for conservation measures, because it's not just the target species that would benefit from it, but all those the food supply of all species within that area as well. So it's a really important aspect to include. And if you look at the area on the right, it shows that those areas in blue that were the foraging ranges, they are almost entirely included within one of the areas of interest in the final report. And especially the southeast coast area of interest, that foraging range is almost entirely included there. So then looking at migration bottlenecks and seabirds areas of interest and how they were mapped. Within the southeast coast area of interest, you can see that there are two migration bottlenecks. They're a little hard to make out in this map, but it's Carnsore Point and Brownstown Head. And the southeast coast is a true seabird hotspot in terms of its activity. 34 of the 38 seabird species that were included in this report were recorded as occurring within this area. And one study has actually shown that there were 28 different species recorded here at any one time. So it's a really important area, and there are several key colonies occurring within this area as well. So for example, Ladies Island Lake, which is important for roseate terns and sandwich terns, which we have here. And then also the salty islands, which is really important for gannets, razorbills, puffins and guillemots, and also for kittiwakes and cormorants as well, which we don't have pictured here. And this migration bottleneck analysis focused on coastal areas only, those areas that are seen as protruding out into the sea or peninsulas, and also can be known as like migration hotspots or corridors as well. So overall, this is the seabird area of interest and the alignment with the areas of interest defined in our final report. There were 14 seabird area of interest outlined from the analysis, and those are shown in the red sections here. And then the final delineated areas of interest across all taxa groups are in these kind of grid areas as well. So those seabird areas, again, as I mentioned, were based on species richness, on migration bottlenecks and foraging range, and also then on the presence of tube noses in offshore areas, but we didn't touch on that today because we're just looking at a coastal range. So I'll pass over now to Simon, who will take you through the citations, and the rest of the team and Claire.
Thanks, Sinead. Simon's is setting up another presentation here, so I'd say just take him a second. And while Simon's doing that, just remind people that if you have any questions about what you're hearing, if you want a few more details on anything, feel free to stick your question into the Q&A. And Simon, you are currently on mute, so just okay.
It's only that easy. Thank you, Kieran. I'm sitting here in West Clare with some of our team. I have Becky and Sibéal and Megan here. So like all these projects, they're a big team effort. Hannah Keogh did all the mapping for the Irish Run Dolphin Group, and Sibéal did a lot of the text, but I was asked to do a presentation mainly on baleen whales. Sorry, share the screen. Looking at baleen whales as an example of how we went about the process. Okay, can you see that? Yeah.
That looks good, Simon. Yeah, thanks a million.
Okay. So as Regina and Sinead have shown, the same kind of process in terms of mapping the densities and distribution of whales and dolphins around Ireland. And I just focus a wee bit maybe on the larger whales and how we've identified areas of featured interest for whales and dolphins. Okay, so 26 species of whales and dolphins in Ireland, from harbour porpoises, which are widespread and abundant, especially off the east coast. We've got a number of different dolphin species, bottlenose dolphins, which again are very common coastally, and a lot of the features of interest, sites of interest feature bottlenose dolphins and harbour porpoises. Common dolphins, very abundant. They are actually quite common in Ireland, living up to their name, especially off the southwest coast, especially in the winter in the Celtic Sea, so big seasonal changes. Striped dolphins, a warm water species, which seems to be increasing in numbers in terms of stranding. So, we are experiencing and recording a lot of change in our marine mammal community in Ireland. Rissos, dolphins. Offshore, we might see longfin pilot whales along the shelf edge. We've got very, very important habitats for these beaked whales, deep diving species, some of which we haven't seen alive in Ireland, but do strand, and some species worldwide are only known from their genetics. They're that elusive. And then, of course, some of the larger whales, the humpback whale, fin whale, blue whale. And in the 25th year of the Irish Whale and Dolphin Group, we had our 25th species, which to our surprise was a bowhead whale off Carlingford Loch in County Louth. Bowheads are normally associated with the pack ice. There was no pack ice in Carlingford that day. So whether this is a breakdown of the Arctic ecosystems and species moving south, we wait to see. But you know, it's an interesting, and I think the point is that we're living in a great period of time and flux, so we need to be able to account for that as well. And then just this year, we've had a new species, a dwarf sperm whale, which again is kind of slightly warm water species that was live stranded down in Glengarriff. So obviously this wide range of species, like with all the other species of interest, reflects this huge diversity of habitats we have in Ireland, from the shallow continental shelf around Ireland, the deep abyssal plains, and to the shelf edge habitats here, which have long been seen as a migratory pathway for the large baleen whales. Our main whaling station in Ireland was off the northwest Mayo, intercepting mainly fin whales as they passed along the western seaboard of Ireland. And you know, many of you are familiar with the kind of real map of Ireland. So we can see us and the government have huge challenges to start protecting representative habitats in the wider Irish context, i.e. at sea. So if we're watching from land, this would be typical of what we might see. Harbour porpoises, bottlenose dolphins, common dolphins, minke whales. But I draw your attention to this big segment, which is humpback and fin whales. Most of these records, largely got through citizen science, are from land and in our coastal waters. Typically, there's a peak in the summer, but you can see that it's not unusual to see large baleen whales off our coasts at certain times of year, which is, you know, fantastic and very exciting. Clearly, species such as humpback whales, which are probably iconic, the raising of that tail fluke is the kind of the, when I was younger, it was the image of the environmental movement. And to enable people to see and experience humpback whales in our inshore coastal waters is huge. We are very, very privileged. And I think we need to start from that position, is that we are lucky to have such rich marine biodiversity, and we need to do the right thing to protect them. Clearly, humpback whales are supporting an increasing marine tourism industry, and humpback whale records are spreading up the west coast. So it's a great news story. Here we can see humpback whales being harassed by common dolphins, actually bow riding humpback whales. I'd say that's quite annoying, but they seem to tolerate it. We've also can use photo ID to recognize individual whales. So over the last 20 years, we have over 1,000 records of photographed humpback whales, largely collected through citizen science. If you think about it, someone has to go out, find a humpback whale, and then photograph the tail fluke of that humpback whale, and then send it to the Irish Whale and Dolphin Group so we can match it. So we know that it's not just humpback whales coming to Irish waters, it's the same individual whales coming back year after year after year. The reciting rate is on average about 63% of the whales we've seen in previous years. And they're not here for a few days. The average residency in Irish waters is over a month, and some will be here for 6 months. So Ireland is really, really important. And this kind of data supports our knowledge, but also our ability to identify really important habitats for these species. We tried similar work with fin whales. They're much more difficult to photograph and to recognize individually, but we have a very high reciting rate, 18% of fin whales too. So the same fin whales are returning to our coastal waters each year. If we go offshore, it's a huge challenge. How do you record whales and dolphins offshore? For many years, we used ships of opportunity, ferries, research vessels. The Marine Institute were particularly supportive, offering the Celtic Explorer as a platform. And way back in 2013, we produced these maps of offshore distribution of whales and dolphins. These are the first maps produced, but you can see the offshore effort is kind of limited. So dipping into this for the large whales, you can see this is a map of fin whale sightings. clustered around the south and southwest coast inshore, and also along that shelf edge, which was the historical migratory pathway of fin whales moving through the western seaboard of Ireland. There's been a couple of more dedicated surveys, which the data we've dipped into to provide information for the maps. Here's the porcupine sea bite. This is a number of largely seismic surveys. A guy called Mick Baines, who was the MMO, recorded many sightings of fin and blue whales in the porcupine sea bite in September. I think it was September 2017-16. Huge numbers. And they were following northern krill. And the tuna fleet were following the krill, and the whales were following everybody. So you can see that all these things are interconnected. But to identify maybe seasonally important habitats, such as the porcupine sea bite, is important for MPAs, because MPAs can be seasonal, and they can also kind of measures can be switched on and off depending on the time of year or the presence of animals. And here's a map of sperm whales, which aren't baleen whales, I know, but they're big and they live offshore, and you can see they're clustering around the northwest slopes, which is a feature of interest, which we've put sperm whales in as a feature of interest. Another video just to remind you what we're looking at. This was a very unusual sighting for us. This is a fin whale close inshore here off West Clare last year. You'd think the second biggest animal on the planet would be relatively easy to record. They're actually not. They're one of the fastest whales in the sea as well. They're known as the greyhounds of the sea. So they can be difficult to record. They can be difficult to see visually. You might note the white right lower jaw, which is a diagnostic feature of a fin whale. So that was a great moment. I'm very lucky. And the idea is that if we look out for habitat, these whale populations will continue to increase and continue to grace our waters. They've been protected 50 years now. So when it comes to offshore, we're dipping into another data set, and this is acoustics. Acoustics provides a very powerful tool for vocalizing whales and dolphins. So here is a vocalization of a fin whale. It's very low frequency. You're talking 20 hertz. So low frequency sound travels a long way, and they make these very distinctive calls. So by putting in sound recorders, such as these AMARs that we deployed through government funding in 2015 and 2016 along the shelf edge. You can see all the way from the northwest to the Whittard Canyon down in the southwest. We can use these to detect the presence and absence of these whale species. So this acoustic data set was really useful for looking at offshore whale and dolphin distribution. So here's an example of a blue whale. I've never seen a blue whale in Irish waters. I think I might have seen one, but I can't be sure. And you know, how do we monitor, or how do we record the presence of one of the rarest whales on our planet? Through these acoustics. So you can see this is we had 880 acoustic detections over the 2 years of survey, and you can see that there's none in the spring. They start arriving in the summer, and then they're detected at all stations during the winter. Now, these circles are very big because this represents the detection distance of these acoustic devices for blue whales. We think we could detect blue whales and fin whales up to 200 kilometers away. So they're quite hard to use that data to identify particular features of interest, but we know they're there, and the island is important at certain times of year for these large whales. Using the same data set, this is some of the fin whale data to try and use an index of abundance, if you like, to try and get some idea of seasonal and geographical importance. And you can see that fin whales look like they're here in the autumn and winter and the spring, but largely absent here in the summer. And they're present at all stations. This actually could be an artifact of their behavior, that they're not vocalizing as much during the summer as they are in the winter. Vocalizing for these whales could be a precursor of breeding. So the lack of absence of fin whales here acoustically doesn't mean they're not there, it's just we couldn't detect them. But it's still a really powerful data set. So we know Ireland is a feeding area for a lot of these large whales. But obviously, if we want to protect them, we need to try and connect the breeding and the feeding grounds, which we've done for humpback whales in Irish waters. That after 17 years, we finally managed to match individual whales from Ireland to Cape Verde. But that's really the only species we know where the breeding grounds are. There is a record of a blue whale from the Azores, individual blue whales matched from the Azores to Iceland by Ken Sullivan during his work with RTL Ocean Giants. and obviously migrating on the western seaboard. But clearly it's important that we don't look in isolation, that we look at in Ireland connecting to other countries that we share whale populations with. And it gets quite complicated if you start overlaying all the different movements. This is just the humpback whales, and this is a dumbed down version of what we think the movements are between all the different breeding and feeding areas. So how do we use this information? So this is just a snapshot of the different species of large baleen whales, which sites of interest we've included whales as a feature of interest. So you can see minke whales mainly along the east coast and southwest coast inshore. Humpback whales, surprisingly, we only have data to support inshore MPAs off the southwest and southwest coasts. Blue whales, we think we have enough data to support 2 sites in the Porcupine Sea Bight and down the Whittard Canyon. But fin whales actually feature in a number of potential MPAs, both inshore and offshore. So that's how we've tried to integrate an acoustic data set with the visual data set to give us the best available data set to inform our areas of interest. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Simon. Thanks everyone for being so timely. So we've got some time for questions now. So we've got one question in the Q&A. So for all those people watching at home or in your office, feel free to stick in a few more if you like. Keep us busy for the next few minutes. So we'll definitely get through down to the one question anyway shortly. Just to say a quick word that this report process has been very positive. I work for the Irish Wildlife Trust, but we've got the Irish Wildlife Trust, the Irish Whale and Dolphin Group, and BirdWatch Ireland all working together under the Fair Seas campaign for this particular project, or for this particular part of the project, this report. And it's brought a lot of other partners in as well. So it's a very positive step, and it is a step. So this report is to get people talking about where MPA should go. It's a really important conversation that we need to start. As Simon mentioned, there's a sort of a lack of data, which is another point that comes out of this report, that there's a lot of work to be done in getting more data. But it's we have sort of suggested where we think the MPAs could go based on the data that is available and where we're coming from, which is the best protection for marine life. So there's a couple of questions coming in now. One of them the first one is from Sheila, and Sheila has gotten straight down to the nuts and bolts of it. So she says, if MPAs don't offer much protection, would no fish zones and marine reserves be any better? So we've got a couple of different terms in there, and that is very normal that in this area, there's a few different terms being used. So that's another part of this project. We try and clarify that. So I guess your statement, Sheila, that MPAs don't offer much protection, that really depends on what MPA it is. So perhaps someone could volunteer to answer this one and clarify what an MPA is and the different levels of protection that might exist in an MPA and some of those terminologies. It's actually very good to clarify that at the start of the conversation. Regina? I think we'll start off with Regina, but if anyone else wants to jump in, this is a very big point and definitely no harm giving it some time. So yeah, Regina, you want to go ahead there?
It is, yeah. So the government is actually writing their national MPA legislation at the moment. We do not have even a definition for a marine protected area in Ireland at the moment. So that's a process that's still ongoing. And depending on that definition and depending on that legislation, we're either going to get really good MPAs or not so good MPAs. In terms of the international guidelines, a marine protected area, no matter how strictly or not it is protected, should always exclude industrial scale activities. So that's the International Union for the Conservation of Nature guidelines that say that. So MPAs can absolutely be beneficial, even if they allow low impact fishing or other kind of large scale low impact extractive activities. So it completely depends on the management measures in the MPAs. The kind of protected areas we have in Ireland at the moment, there's special areas of conservation and special protection areas. They are based on EU legislation, and they can actually be quite good if we were implementing the legislation properly. But Ireland currently isn't doing that. So we are allowing pretty much everything inside the current protected areas. So that's why they're not working. So we obviously want marine protected areas that are properly managed and enforced, and they can be very beneficial, even if they allow low impact fishing to take place. Does that answer it?
That, well, it starts to answer it. It's, yeah, very good. Yeah, so there is, it's all about implementation. So I think, Sheila, to answer your question, is marine protected areas certainly can protect marine life if they are managed correctly. And maybe just if anyone else in the virtual room might, yeah, go for it, Regina.
Just to elaborate, in terms of the no fish zone, so a marine protected area can be a no fish zone, and it can also be a zone where fishing is allowed. So they have this scale of marine protected areas in terms of how strictly they are protected. So I guess that, yeah, the terms are a bit confusing, but a no take zone or no fish zone can be one type of a marine protected area. And there are studies that, lots of studies that show those kind of protected areas are much better at restoring marine life than the areas that allow fishing. Simply put, if you're trying to protect biodiversity, you do best not to also kill biodiversity. It just isn't rocket science. It makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and I think, yeah, going into a little bit more detail, I mean, marine protected areas, as you say, can work. Does anyone maybe want to offer a bit of information about an example, maybe overseas or somewhere that someone's familiar with, where marine protected areas are working and supporting nature and people? It's always good to look to the good examples. I mean, I know, Sheila, we're not great in Ireland at getting it right always, but that's what we're hoping that we will do this time, that we will get it right and make marine protected areas work. So has anyone even got like a little snippet of an idea of somewhere where they have worked for people in nature? We can tell the folks about that. Yeah, Simon's got his hand up. Go for it, Simon.
Well, I mean, a lot of the example is the Lyme Bay Reserve down off the Devon coast. And I think one of the good parts of that MPA, which I think is over 10 years now designated, and not all fishing was restricted. It was an important benthic habitat for a range of species. Not all fishing is restricted. You know, you're still allowed to do potting. In fact, actually, the fishermen there are using the fact that they catch fish in marine reserve as a branding, and they get a premium price for that product. But one of the good advantages of that MPA is the amount of monitoring that was done pre and during the restrictions, if you like, to see what was the effect of removing bottom trawling, for example. And I think that's what we really need in these early days of MPA designation and monitoring, is that, you know, government really need to have very, very detailed and widespread monitoring protocols in place, so that we can see the impacts, good or bad, working, not working, and the timelines it takes for habitats hopefully to recover, and fish biomass. So there's a lot of figures on that one, the Lyme Bay Reserve, in terms of fish biomass, fish species diversity, the spillover effect, if you like, where the fish adjacent to the MPA is also increased as well. So there aren't, we looked at this when we were doing the report, good examples of MPAs closer to home, because the closer to home to Ireland, the more relevant they are. You know, there's plenty of examples in the Pacific, in warmer climates, if you like, but less good long-term studies. Certainly, there's very few whale and dolphin ones. I suspect seabirds as well. So there are some good studies on habitats, marine habitats from the UK and from Europe. But it does take a long time. I mean, we need to accept that probably a minimum of 10 years before you're going to have any tangible, measurable, quantifiable impacts of these conservation measures. I'm not sure that answers the question, just adds a bit of Fail, Kieran.
Well, you did mention one good example at the start. It was just that was Lion Bay, was it? That was your, yeah. Excellent. Before we move on, anyone else want to come in on that point of sort of positive examples of MPAs working for people in nature? No. Okay. So, Grant, loads of questions popped up, which is brilliant. I might cluster kind of two because they have similar questions. We should be able to get around to all of them in the time we have, but there's two about monitoring. So, you did just touch on that, Simon. And so just to clarify, Fair Seas is a campaign led by environmental NGOs. The monitoring of marine protected areas would be, certainly something for the state, scientists to carry out. But there's two questions. One is how are MPAs monitored? That's coming in from Joe. And then Val Freeman asks about monitoring as well, like what's the Fair Seas team hope on monitoring? Val then also asks about the timing of designation, which is very important. So we can maybe talk to that point as well. But maybe just quickly on monitoring, does anyone have any opinions? Val asked what our opinion was, Fair Seas, on how monitoring should be done. Simon's going for that one. Oh, and Aoife.
Sorry, I was just going to jump in there and say that we had hoped to cover some of that in this initial report, but the report itself, there was enough to look at just identifying the areas of interest. So rather than delaying the report, we wanted to issue the areas of interest to get the conversation started rather than delving into the different management types, because we are looking across the world at best practice to see the different levels of management. And we've seen across the world that areas have been designated and countries have celebrated their MPAs, and then they've gone back to look at them through a lens and realized that they haven't implemented their management plans properly to ensure that they are effective MPAs. So that is another body of work that needs to be done in Ireland, and that's for the government to look at now. The next steps in this process are the legislation, hopefully, which will be in the next 12 months. And then once the legislation is in place, then designation can be put in place. And once the designation is in place, then we need to look at management plans, effective management plans going forward. And that's a big conversation to be had with a lot of stakeholders. So there's a lot of steps along the way. We hope the management plans will be thought about over the next while the legislation has been made, and hopefully that's going to feed into the legislation as well, so that that the legislation will be robust and will do what we need it to do. So just to kind of give that kind of oversight just on the management side of things, that our report focused mostly on the areas of interest rather than the actual management plans, because there's a big body of work to be done on those, and different ones perhaps for different areas as well going forward.
Great. Thank you, Aoife. Simon, did you have something you wanted to add to how? No. Okay. So so essentially, monitoring certainly does need to happen. We haven't covered it in this report, but the Fair Seas team certainly recognizes the need to actually monitor the MPAs after they've been designated, for sure. I'm just gonna manage my questions here. So the second part of Val's, or the other part of Val's question, was quite important. Really important to the Fair Seas campaign, and it's what does the Fair Seas campaign hope for the timing of designation? So I suppose you were mentioning legislation there, Aoife. That's really the crux of it, or at least a lot of it when it comes to the timing. So maybe do you want to jump back in, and if anyone else wants to jump in on this one about what we hope for in terms of the timing of designation?
So we've been talking to the team working in the Department of Housing and Local Government, and they are working on the legislation at the moment, and we are working with them to see if we can input to the legislation as soon as the heads of bill are ready. And we're hoping that perhaps this will be finalised before Christmas this year. That's our current timeline. We're not exactly sure. Obviously, there's a lot of things happening in government at the moment, a lot of conflicting priorities, but at the moment, we're hoping that before Christmas, we may see the final draft of the legislation.
So we're hoping to see designation before Christmas.
But that's legislation before Christmas. And then designation will follow, but there's still a lot of stakeholder engagement and conversations to be had before designation. So I don't have the answer for when the designations will happen. I'm not sure if any of my colleagues have an educated guess on that, but we're hoping sooner rather than later.
Yes, and if anyone else wants to come in on that, for sure. And just to add something to that conversation, I'm just trying to link up questions here. Vincent Hyland, again, asking about timing of the Irish government's designation for MPAs, and is it with the overall European context. So of course, the EU has set targets as well. He asked, is this being coordinated across Europe? Does anyone want to comment on that question? Is the designation of marine protected areas being coordinated across Europe? And if so, by who? Regina, you go ahead.
No, it's not coordinated. It's completely up to the member states to do their own thing. Ireland is generally way behind all of the immediate neighbours in terms of designating MPAs. So France already has a lot of their waters designated. UK is above 30%. Germany is around 45% or something of their EEZ being protected. So Ireland's way behind, and there's been no coordination from Europe. Europe has a new target now of having 30% of Europe waters protected by 2030, of which 10% should be strictly protected under the biodiversity strategy. So that 10% strictly protected adds kind of an additional layer of complexity to that. And again, there's no timeline really for that. I don't think there's yet even a definition of what strict protection is actually going to mean. So no, there's no real coordination. Targets at a European level, yes, but no coordination.
Okay, that would be probably better if it was, but anyway. Grand. Okay, so there is, let me see, what should we deal with next? There's some very nice questions in here, which I'll maybe get people to think about. One was Joe O'Sullivan. Aside from collecting seaside garbage and plastic, how can the common man, the common person help, I presume help with marine life? So I'll let people think about that for a second. So aside from collecting garbage, how can the common person help with this topic? There's a specific question here that was asked. Let me just find it again. Yes. Aaron McKeown is asking, was there a consideration given to an all-Ireland approach to MPA network, or cross-border sites of importance identified? So yeah, that's certainly we should probably mention that. But was there any sort of consideration given to doing a cross-border approach or including Northern Ireland? I suppose. Yeah. Does anyone want to answer that or?
Yeah, I can quickly jump in. So
sure.
I actually had that question before, as soon as the report was out, and it's a really interesting thought. We unfortunately didn't think about it this time around, but I think there should be something. Maybe in the next stage should be to look at cross-border marine protected areas.
Yeah, Simon, jump in there.
Yeah, in fairness, you know, obviously our campaign is with the Irish government. In Northern Ireland, certainly from a whale and dolphin point of view, they would already be above 30% designation through MPA SECs. So they're actually way ahead of us. So we're still catching up with Northern Ireland. And, you know, our policy officer, Donald Griffin, has huge experience of the Northern Irish process, being heavily involved in it the last few years. So we're very lucky to bring a lot of that experience cross-border to our Fair Seas campaign. So I think there are very strong links there, but we need to play catch up before we can start looking at maybe cross-border management strategies, which would be really, really essential, I think.
And sorry,
we have two people there. Regina, you go ahead, and then Aoife, you jump in.
Just to say that we did look at the marine protected areas that are designated immediately on the borders. So we saw earlier that Scotland has the seamount protected, so that would be one potential cross-border site with Scotland, at least. So we did look in terms of overall what is protected at the moment across the border and how can we maybe add to that.
Great, and I just wanted to follow up on Simon's comments that we are working with colleagues across the border, and one of our external reviewers was Dr. Annika Clements from Ulster Wildlife, who did give us input into the report at early stages and also at the late stages of it. So absolutely, we're trying to learn from what they've done before, so that we learn from what they've done well, and we learn from any mistakes that have happened around the world as well. So we are trying to leverage those relationships.
Excellent. We're at 12 now, so we'll take one or two more questions and then we'll let everyone go. There's an interesting one which I suppose hasn't been touched on yet, and it is very important, from Lydia. And it's really, just to paraphrase it, she's complimenting the report saying it's very interesting. But it's talking about stakeholder engagement. How do you think we should go about deciding the level of protection that doesn't exclude everyone? So I think that's certainly a massively important part of the designation process. This report was looking at the marine life and how best to protect that. But I think it's worth maybe just discussing this, like how about stakeholder engagement. So does anyone want to maybe mention how we think stakeholder engagement could be beneficial or should be done? Obviously, this is more something the state needs to do, but it's something we're very interested in as well at Fair Seas. So does anyone want to answer Linda's question about how you think we should go about stakeholder engagement?
I could jump in. So we need to find a process that works for Ireland, and the government needs to do that. But there is a really good example for Lyme Bay, which was already mentioned earlier, where the Blue Marine Foundation and local fishermen worked together to propose a management plan for the area that worked for everyone. They did exclude scallop dredgers from the area because that was the most kind of impacting activity. But they did end up working very closely with the potting fleet, and the potting fleet weren't excluded from Lyme Bay, and it still recovered very, very well. So that showed that low impact fishing can be compatible with marine protected area objectives. But in some cases, we might need even stricter protections than that. So I think it's just working very closely. It's a very long process, but working closely with local communities to figure out what works.
Okay, great. Just to say that, let me see, what else have we got here? There's a question from Duncan saying, are you confident the government will implement this in a meaningful way? I don't know if anyone wants to jump in on that.
Well, I think I'd jump in there and just say that, you know, individuals as voters have a responsibility to ask questions of government representatives in their locality, and we need to bring this up as a conversation at all opportunities. If we want to protect our ocean for our generation or for the next generation, we really need to ask the questions: what is the government doing at local level, national level, and European level? And I think every individual can do that today. So we will, at later stages in the campaign, be asking people to sign up to support what we're doing, and also having specific asks when needed from the campaign. So we'd ask people just to follow the campaign as well, and just keep the conversation about our ocean and our responsibility to protect it alive.
Thanks, Aoife. And actually, that maybe links in, that answers Joe's question about what people can do. And there's another question there, which maybe we'll just jump straight onto, which is Adrian Gatton asked the combined number of public members supporting the Fair Seas campaign, i.e. the NGOs involved. Do we have a number for that? I suppose we might have a ballpark figure, because it's a good point that Adrian raises, is that this is a campaign and it's been supported by various environmental NGOs. So there's a lot of sort of people behind the people running this project. So yeah, even I don't know if you have a figure to hand or a ballpark figure.
Yeah, so this campaign is a coalition of 8 NGOs, and it's the first time in Ireland that so many NGOs have come together on a campaign. And we haven't totaled the number of members on the ground yet, but that's a really good thing for us to do. But what we have totaled is the social media presence of all of our partners, and combining all of our Facebook followers and newsletter subscribers, etc. We're at about 380,000 people following the NGOs that are involved with this campaign. So that's a good number to start with. We have a lot more to reach with the campaign, but we're hopeful that we can get the message out.
Excellent. And on that, I suppose just that mentioned, we are a coalition, and we have the partners in the room who were directly involved in writing this report. But just to give a shout out to everyone else, we also have Sustainable Networks Ireland, our partners in this project, are our friends of the Irish environment, the Koala Salmon Trust, the Irish Environmental Network, and Coastwatch Ireland. So there's a great big gang of us all doing our best to save the seas and work together on this campaign. So okay, yes, Simon has his hand up. Sinead, you put your virtual hand up for a second as well. Did you want to come in on anything, or was that a... virtual.
I was just going to make the point that Aoife made so eloquently about keeping on your politicians and putting the pressure on throughout the campaign as we have specific asks. So thanks.
Excellent. And I'll just ask our panelists to just have a quick look at the Q&A, because I don't think we're going to get to everything. So if there's anything you want to answer, let me know. And Simon, you did have your hand up already. Was it for something you wanted to come in on?
Just a quick one, just to follow on from Aoife and Sinead, really, is one of the ambitions of the campaign is to create that sense of ocean stewardship. And I think it's really critical that people who want to get involved and to solicit change, take ownership, take ownership of your patch, find out about what occurs in your area, be informed, because by being informed, we can question decisions, we can challenge politicians, managers in an informed, knowledgeable way, and debate these issues with other stakeholders. So I think, obviously through the Fair Seas campaign, we can provide a certain level of information. I know we're going to be developing a toolkit down the road as part of the campaign for local communities. So I think, on top of following the campaign, is take ownership of your patch, understand what's there, understand the importance of it, and treasure and nurture it, because MPAs are for all of us. We are an ocean, an island nation. I often say people in Cavan are islanders. They might not realise it, but they are. So I think that's a strong part of our Fair Seas campaign, is creating that spirit of ocean stewardship.
And just on the point as well of getting involved and how can people do this? I think as Simon said, we are all islanders and we each have a voice and a vote. So you can use that, hold the government accountable, and just get informed. And part of the work is obviously spreading the message of Fair Seas and what it means. And I was recently in a school with 4th class children discussing whales and dolphins, and they had this hunger for knowledge. They wanted to learn more. So we ended up working over a month on a big research project. And those, I think about 30 or 40 4th class students wrote formal letters to the ministers asking them why we were only at 2% marine protected areas and why there was no management plans. So I think if a 4th class national school student in Ireland can hold the government accountable, then really all of us should be able to, especially those with a vote. So that's just another point.
Thanks, Sibéal. That's brilliant. Great. So we're getting towards the end. There's Regina, you have your hand up. There's 1 or 2 more questions which I've identified here that we might just not answer quickly before the end. But Regina, you work away there. You have your hand up for.
Yeah, just because that links in nicely. There's one question here about which government departments will be involved in the implementation, etc., of MPAs. So the main department is actually the Department of Housing. So Minister Darragh O'Brien and Minister Malcolm Noonan will be the main ministers if you're thinking about sending some letters. They'll be the ones to target. But of course, this is a huge project. So Minister McConalogue for Fisheries will be hugely important as well in this, and Eamon Ryan as well for rolling out wind farms. In terms of spatial planning, this is really complex, but definitely the Department of Housing will be the main people that will have to implement this.
Excellent, and they can thank us later for that shout out to all the people. And you mentioned actually wind, and it's a hugely important area, and there was a direct question about it, so I think we should just touch on that. So I know, Aoife, maybe I might let you just clarify this one from a Fair Seas point of view, but John Britton asks, are wind farms classified as industrial activity? And if they are, what will happen regarding their applications in proposed MPAs? So obviously we aren't going to be the ones deciding which wind farms get to go where, but Regina mentioned it there, and they are an important part of the picture. So maybe if you just want to mention like where Fair Seas stands on that at the moment.
Absolutely. I mean, the campaign is supportive of renewable energy. We want to ensure it's in the right place, and that was part of the reason we drew up these areas of interest, was to identify the areas of interest for environmental reasons, so that we can begin discussions on the best use of our oceans in the right places. So we're just really keen to ensure that we are thinking about all different elements of the ocean when we're drawing lines on maps, that we're taking everything into account. And that's what we really do hope this report will do, just start that conversation with all of the key stakeholders, and that includes offshore wind.
Yeah, exactly. And I think we have Fairfields has taken an important step of publishing this, starting the conversation, which really needs to happen like as soon as possible. So yeah, that's really what we're doing here. Okay, there's actually a very interesting question here for the people on the call who are data heads and who have spent months mining data to create this report. Val asked, Val Freeman, are we in a position to share raw data on specific species if they will be useful for other groups? So I think most of the data we used was certainly like open source, but I let maybe Sinead, you can maybe, if everyone just mentions a little bit for those interested in the data, where you might have got your data and where people can look for it. Whoever wants to jump in first can jump in, and we'll go to all three of us. So, so I wasn't putting anyone on the spot there. So maybe, yeah, sure. You don't need to go into great detail about where you got your data because that will take forever, but just Val is interested in the data, and the data is really important. So maybe for other people, researchers on this call, maybe we just touch on where some of the places we found data.
Yeah, of course. So for the seabird data, it was obviously a massive, and for all of the species groups, a massive amount of data to get through. In terms of colony locations and counts, we use some BirdWatch Ireland studies and data from the National Parks and Wildlife Service that is completed as part of the Article 12 reporting under the EU Birds Directive. So that might be a useful place, and even some BirdWatch Ireland data as well. We use BirdWatch Ireland data in addition to BirdLife International data as well, and they have a really good data source online, which could be helpful to get some of your kind of population counts there. So I guess it depends on what exactly you want to look at, and also in terms of offshore and other places where we got data from. The Observe program was another source, and we can certainly, if you look into the annexes and the report, it'll list out all of the places where we got that data. So if that's any help.
Thanks, Sinead. Excellent. Anyone else want to jump in on that one too for Val? Yeah, Sibéal, go for it.
Yeah, so just like Sinead said there, we also used a mix of kind of government data and our own as well that was collected by the Irish Whale and Dolphin Group on different surveys. But certainly any data used like the Observe data or anything from the fisheries surveys. So MMOs would go out on a lot of the Marine Institute fisheries surveys to record marine mammals. That's all open access that you can get under freedom of information, but you do have to request you do have to request it from National Parks and Wildlife or the Marine Institute, which can be a long process, but you should be able to get access to it.
All that data is data request.
Yeah, and the Irish Whale and Dolphin Group data as well. You just have to fill out a data request form, but you know we think that data should be shared freely as well to get the most out of it. So I hope that answers the question.
I'll just jump in terms of like National Parks and Wildlife Service data. So sometimes the license doesn't allow us to share what we have. So you have to go back to the source, which is a shame because it took us a lot of time to collate the data, but we're not allowed to share it in most cases. So mine for the Erasmus Branks came from trawl surveys, so that's freely available as well, and the database for trawl surveys website run by ICES. So yeah, well, it's freely available.
Saying Kieran and Val, you know, a huge amount of time was put in by Regina, Sarah, and Hannah just trying to clean up the data so that it can be used. You know, so don't underestimate the handling time and energy to you get the data set, but to prepare it in a way for mapping is a huge undertaking. as well as patience. You need a lot of patience for that as well. So, you know, there's data and data, and it's you get the data, but how you deal with it is can be quite a challenge, you know.
Indeed. So I guess, yeah, Val, you and anyone else can email Fair Seas to, you know, specifically ask for pointers on particular data, and we'll try and get back to you, or we'll pass it on to the scientists in question who are working on that. So we're over time now, so I will finish up. We got around to nearly all the questions. There's one or two there that we can get back to in writing, specific questions, one specific question there from Lydia. And just to finish, I've left Joe's question up to what can people do to help out with this cause. Just if anyone wants the last word on that, if anyone feels there's any other suggestions that people can do to help marine life in Ireland, other than obviously following the Fair Seas campaign, joining the newsletter and following the work. Yeah, does anyone else want one or two last sentences on that question before we finish up?
I suppose getting involved is the most important thing. You know, we have a beautiful ocean, and no matter how you engage with it, your passion for it grows every time you engage with it. So just learning more about our ocean, learning more about the different species, and participating in the citizen science activities of all of our organizations, ensuring you're registered for a vote, and voting at the right time, I think, is important. But really just getting passionate about the ocean and keeping the conversation of ocean protection going is very important.
Indeed. Excellent. And I think that's the thing. I mean, at the Irish Wildlife Trust, our whole kind of cause is getting people involved in protection of nature. And a framework that I think about is that really we interact with nature as individuals, as communities, and also as a state. So they're the three levels where an individual can get involved. So at the individual level, it's what you do, your behaviors, your choices. So as Joe said, like picking up litter, your choices on what you eat and what you do. Then at the community level, you can, you know, support the community who are interested in nature conservation. So, you know, join a nature NGO, support this campaign, interact with your community, your coastal community in this case. And then at the state level, it's, as Aoife said, you know, as all of us have said, you know, contacting your politicians, interacting with the state, keeping an eye out for public consultations. So really there's sort of those three levels that humans affect nature, and a concerned individual can act on all of them. So that's really the message, or a message anyway. So we've had a few thanks coming in on the chat. So thank you for the thanks. And I think I'll wrap it up there. This was recorded and it will be up. Okay, I see your hand, Simon.
There's a really good question there from Owen Clarkin about how well are we funded to keep this campaign going. I think that would be a really good one to answer. Maybe Eve could answer that in terms of our timelines. Sure.
Thanks, Simon. So this campaign is officially a 3-year campaign, and we are funded by international partners who are working on similar projects around the globe. So we're taking advice from them on what is best practice and learning from their partners all around the world. So some of our funders include Oceans 5, Beck Family Trust, and the Weiss Foundation, and Conservation International. So we are very grateful for those funders for supporting us. But if anybody has a checkbook, we won't say no. But yes, we are funded adequately for the moment. But there's a huge challenge ahead of us, and we have to focus on the challenge ahead of us and see how far we can go with the current level of funding that we have.
Excellent. So the good news is Fair Seas is not just for Christmas. We're around for at least 3 years to work on this important work, and we're supported by brilliant environmental NGOs and networks. So yep, we're here, and we're going to work on this on the behalf of people and nature. So okay, thank you everyone for your time, all the panelists. Thank you all the attendees for listening and for your questions. This will be up on YouTube. Certainly Fair Seas and IWT both will make that available for everyone to see. And yeah, thanks for your time and enjoy your lunch. Bye everybody.